I am PLO Lumumba here at the Aberdares Country Club and Sanctuary in Nyeri County in the Republic of Kenya in the continent of Africa. As we continue our conversations about the continent, one of the ever-nagging issues is how Africa can liberate herself completely from the colonizer turned neo-colonizer. And when we discuss this subject, it must be remembered that that liberation must not only be limited to the African continent, but must be extended to Africa in the diaspora. You know, the colonizer sat down. They sat down and conceived an idea. And the idea was to conquer other peoples, and Africa became a target. And in order to do this, the first thing that they did was to attack the African mind. Attack the African mind and attack African spirituality. And that entailed the demonization of everything that was African. If you had an African god, that god had to be demonized. If you had African education, the education had to be demonized. If you had African culture in her diversity, the culture had to be demonized. If you had African ways of doing things in all their permutations, they had to be demonized. Of course, the colonial project appeared to succeed. And that is why African countries were under colonial tutelage for a long time, with major European countries having their spheres of influence and fiefdoms. But the vestiges of liberation and independence were always alive. And this is how you understand the different resistance that were to be found within the continent and outside of the continent. When you talk about the rebellions among the Maji, and when you talk about the Mau Mau, when you talk about Shaka the Zulu, all these were attempts at warding off the colonizer. When the Africans ultimately started regaining political independence, we thought that we had liberated ourselves, but the tragedy was that we received the crown without the crown jewels. And the neo-colonial project remains alive today. Hence, the legitimacy of asking ourselves, how do we liberate ourselves from this particular pain? How do we ensure that the African continent is understood in a manner that speaks to the African peoples? Let me start with religion. Religion is one of the most contentious things to talk about. Today, the dominant religions in the continent of Africa are Christianity, and some of us profess to be Christians. Some of us profess to be Muslims. But let us look at the religion that was brought to the African continent and how it was midwifed. If you are colonized by the Germans, you are likely to have received the Lutheran version of Christianity, in other words, the Germanized kind. If you are colonized by the Dutch, you received the Dutch Reformed Church. If you are colonized by the English, you received the Anglican Church, in other words, the Anglicized version of it. And of course, you also had an addition of the Scottish with the Presbyterian and the Methodist. So all these were midwifed. Even Jesus Christ was whitened and given blue eyes. The first thing that we must do, therefore, is to regain our spirituality and recognize that God is one and is worshipped in different ways. Once we regain our spirituality as a people, then our confidence will remain. The second thing that they did was to interfere with our governance systems. You know, when I look at the governance systems in Africa, when I read the great Ante-Cheikh Diop of Senegal, when he talks about Africa before the advent of colonization, when I look at the kingdom of Sondiata Keita and the home of Mansa Musa, When I look at the old kingdoms in Liberia and in Nigeria and in Ghana and in Kenya and in Buganda and Binyoro Kitara and amongst the Zulu and in the Monomotapa Empire amongst the Ndongo in Angola, I know, and amongst the Oromo, the Gada system, and in Ethiopia, I know that Africans had governance systems which sustained Africa in their diversity. All those were destroyed. They took African leaders, took some of them to the Seychelles Island, St. Helena, exiled them there in places like Haiti. Napoleon captured Toussaint de Louverture and took him to Paris, and he died there. We must reclaim our governance systems and write about them as a weapon in our arsenal in order to liberate ourselves from this thing called democracy. Because this thing called democracy, who came up with it? Is it not true that when the American Declaration of Independence came alive, it said that they held certain truths to be self-evident, that all men were born equal and that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights? When they said that, did the Negro still not remain in captivity? It tells you that when they talked about democracy and the one man, one vote, it was something that defined their own circumstances. Africa must rethink governance systems. And once we have rethought governance systems, then Africa will begin to liberate herself. And in this manner, it is the only way in which we can defeat an enemy who comes in different ways. You know, when we talk about us being in a position to defeat the colonizers, we must also remind ourselves that one of the things that the colonizer uses is to divide and rule. In fact, the British method was divide and rule. They came to Kenya and they told different ethnicities, you are different from the other ethnicity. They went to Nigeria, told the Yoruba, told the Hausa, told the Igbo, told the Kalabari. They went to Ghana, told the Ga, told the Akan. They came to Kenya, told the Agikoyo, told the Luo, told the Abaluhya and the Kalenjin that you are different. And as long as we remain divided, they will always conquer us. And they did not stop there. When they knew that we were regaining independence, they sowed the seeds of disunity amongst us, so that when we speak in tongues. They created a Tower of Babel. That Tower of Babel is what enables them to dominate us. So we must unite. And when I talk about unity, I'm not talking about the unity of the graveyard where there is no noise. I'm talking about unity that allows us to put ideas on the table. And when those ideas have been placed on the table, we may have different perspectives. We may even disagree. But when we disagree in an agreeable manner. And we emphasize the things that unite us and de-emphasize the things that make us disunited. And we must also be strong. You know, this idea of romanticizing our black beauty is without basis and without any fruits. We can be beautiful all we want, but if we are weak, then we are going nowhere. We must be strong. And in gaining our strength, and if we use clubs, we can use clubs all we want, but we want the new clubs. You know, it is in Kiswahili where they say, amani haiji ila kwa ncha ya upanga. Peace does not come other than on the tip of the sword. In other words, when you want peace, you must also be prepared for war. And Africans must now begin to remember that our little armies in Lesotho, in Eswatini, in Kenya, in Uganda, in Mozambique, in Libya, in Eritrea, in Ghana, are useless because an American warship stationed in the Atlantic and one in the Indian Ocean and one south of Africa will decimate all of us. But if we united as one, then we will send a clear message that we are prepared to die one and all for the sake of the mother continent. History is consistent. History is clear that it is only those who are prepared, those who are united, those who speak with one voice, those who are organized are the very same who will liberate themselves. Africa must remember that we are not the only peoples, the only continents who have been enslaved. We are not the only continent and peoples who have been humiliated. Others have been humiliated before, but they have stood up and they have succeeded in ensuring that they liberate themselves. You may say all you want about the Vietnamese. It was the most bombed nation on earth. But they always told the Americans we will never lose, and they never lost. There is something to be taken out of them. We must also ask, how is it that other civilizations have succeeded to withstand Western aggression? We need to have a conversation with the Russians. We need to have a conversation with the Chinese. We need to have a conversation with the Thais. The net effect is that Africa must unite. And as I sit here, I can still hear through the vicissitudes of time the voices of great Africans telling us, unite. I can hear Ahmed Ben Bella shouting from Algeria. I can hear Julius Nyerere shouting from Dar es Salaam. I can hear Robert Mangaliso Sobukwe and Winnie Mandela and Tiro Ngopose shouting from South Africa, let us unite. I can hear Kenneth Kaunda shouting, let us unite. I can hear the Osagie for Kwame Nkrumah. I can hear Amilcar Cabral. I can hear Ahmed Sékou Touré. All of them saying unity. I can hear them saying that you cannot, in the nature of things, do things when you do not unite amongst yourselves. I can hear them saying, let us all have all our beautiful languages, but let us also speak in Kiswahili. I can hear them saying, speak in one commercial language and a currency that is African. I can hear them saying, we can defeat these neo-colonizers. We can defeat them. And when we defeat them, they'll begin to sit with us on the table. They'll begin to respect us. And we'll begin to say with what my good friend Robert Mangaliso is saying, that there is only one race in the world, the human race. That we can do, that we must do, and we know what ought to be done. But there is also another reality. When you are fighting a war, and you are a general, all your secrets must not be known to your enemy. So we can only say so much. Some of our activities must remain subterranean, and subterranean is the way to go. But these are the broad things that it is incumbent upon us to do, because the unity of Africa is necessary, and Africans in the mother continent and in the diaspora, this is the time, wherever you are, in the Caribbean, in America, in Latin America, in Europe, in the mother continent, we must unite, because we must defeat the neo-colonizer. And remember, neo-colonization is the last stage of imperialism, and it's most dangerous because the neo-colonizer is at his most desperate. And we can see it. The desperation is alive and well. They are recruiting us with fifth columnists amongst our ranks, and we must and we will defeat them, if not by this generation, generations yet to come, because the war is intergenerational. Thank you very much. We continue our conversation and we talk about the colonizer. How do we defeat or liberate ourselves from them? But after liberation, after defeat, the day after, what do we do? This is the conversation that we will continue with when we come back. Thank you.